Well, believe it or not, this week wasn't all about Brexit. The Labour Party persuaded the government to release confidential papers relating to universal credit, the flagship reform which compresses 6 benefits into a single payment. And there was an emotional parliamentary debate.
When the little boy was shown the shelf where toys were, but also on that shelf were lunch packs, he chose the lunch pack.
A heartbreaking detail about a child's hunger from the Labour chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, Frank Field, who was followed by a Conservative MP.
Heidi Allen.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I don't know where to start after that. I'm humbled by the words from my honourable good friend from Birkenhead.
I spoke to both afterwards, and I started by asking Heidi, who has campaigned on universal credit and is also a member of the Work and Pensions Committee, why she was tearful.
Because these are very, very real stories. I like any person, I'm particularly affected by the thought of somebody being hungry. I was very, very moved by that and obviously really struggled to regain my composure. I still haven't now, to be honest.
And Frank, you said that, in fact, it was the first time you talked about some of these cases in which you hadn't cried. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the cases you were referring to?
Yes, the background to this is not simply universal credit only. It is that for over 10 years, governments have been rigging the benefits system against families and in advancing, even if only modestly, the position of pensioners. And therefore any slip-ups on universal credit are magnified because there's nothing much for people to fall back on.
And can you just describe some of the cases that you heard about?
Well, the two cases I described to the House of Commons, which was I've done surgeries on Fridays for 38 years. And this gentleman was sitting before me, and I was trying to persuade him not to top himself because he was at the bottom. He could see no way and no hope, no way of getting himself going up again. And when we stood up at the end, he shook my hand. It was the first time that somebody with a wet hand shook my hand. Wet being because he'd been wiping away his tears, talking to his MP on how grim life was and probably not worth living. And the other family was that last year this family was all right because they were in work. They bought a toy to give to our project, to give to poor, hungry families. This year they came in with the 3-year-old crying from hunger and the mum saying, well, don't worry, lad, these people will give us food. And the father then said, that it was not all bad luck, that a neighbour, knowing how desperate their position was, invited them to a funeral because there was a feast after the funeral and there'd be plenty of food and that would give them on that day enough food. But this was a family in work last year that gave a little gift, or maybe a big gift, to other poor families in Birkenhead. This year they would reduce to destitution. Two things I hoped to illustrate from that was, one, how near people are to the line of going under, and that we are seeing it again in Britain, destitution, not just poverty, destitution.
And Heidi, this was in a debate about universal credit. You've been, I don't know if this is a bit much, but a thorn in the government's side in some ways over this benefit. You went to see Theresa May before the budget about it. Tell me what concerns you raised at that point, and then obviously tell us about your reaction to what the government then did.
Frank and I and the rest of the committee have looked at this system as it's been rolling out over the last 2.5 years. And I feel very strongly that it will be, once it's fully up and running and problems with it are ironed out and more funding is put back into it, it will be the most phenomenal transformation of our benefit system for decades. But it's not there yet. And crucially, in October, the government pressed the button to really increase the rollout onto the full-blown system. I then asked the Prime Minister for a meeting. A couple of colleagues came with me, and we just explained to her in very detailed terms what the risks were, why the 6-week wait was unacceptable, why people, as Frank's described, have no savings, nothing to fall back on, often are self-employed, and all the reasons why we needed to make some pretty big changes before the numbers were severely increased that got put onto the system. And that's what we heard then I don't know, was it 3 weeks later or so in the budget, £1.5 billion worth of investment put into universal credit, in large by the work that we did, that Frank led on the Select Committee, and by encouraging the government to very much focus on reducing that 6-week wait, which they did. They reduced it to 5 weeks and also pumped in an additional 2 weeks worth of housing benefit for anybody coming onto the system who's in receipt of it, which are huge. Does it make it the finished article? Absolutely not. Is there still more to do? Will we as a committee keep looking at it? Yes, we will. But did the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Secretary of State listen? Yes, they did. And to that, to them, I'm very, very grateful for doing that, because they have significantly improved the system, and we will keep looking at it.
So Heidi's arguing that they've improved the system, they've reduced that wait. But Frank, one of the problems that we've talked about previously is not actually just about the 6-week wait, but the fact that at one point, George Osborne took £3.4 billion out of the system. Does that mean that transformation Heidi's talking about just isn't possible to achieve?
I mean, I don't have Heidi's confidence about this. There are advantages in having 6 benefits rather than 1, because if one of those 6 goes wrong, you've got the other 5 to rely on. What we've got to make sure is that most people who are on universal credit are not paid monthly, but paid every 2 weeks. It'll be reforms of that nature, which will cost money.
How much?
I don't know, because they're going to have to adapt the software for this. But we won't do a mega report and try and swamp the government with a bill which is impossible. We will actually do it with, I think, Heidi, won't we, piece by piece, with a costed reform, and then go in, all of us, cross-party, to try and get that sum of money allocated to universal credit.
Frank Field and Heidi Allen.